Aujourd'hui, je vais parler de... honestly, I'm just going to react to a single quote from a recent John Oliver episode about the rent being too high, okay? And it's one of those biased reporting that's been getting on my nerves for quite some time now, okay? Hey, XenPuck here. So I'm sure I'm gonna get a bunch of flack or hate here, but whatever. That's the advantage of being retired, right? I don't really have to take other people's opinions into account whatsoever. So what set me off recently is one of those reporting pieces from John Oliver that sounds good on paper, but is of course based on a false premise, right? The subject is about skyrocketing rent in this current atmosphere. Just so I'm clear, I'm not here to talk about whether I think the rent is too much of a burden, simply because that is actually quite a regional and localized problem, right? What I want to address is how most of the left likes to frame this issue, and it boils down to this singular quote, and I'll read it now, okay? Right now, in no county in the US can a worker earning the minimum wage afford a modest two-bedroom rental home. End quote. Okay, yeah, let that sink in for a moment. Minimum wage should translate into a two-bedroom home. Is it weird that I have a huge problem with that? Hey, maybe I am weird. Okay, that's definitely possible, right? So, but if I am wrong, please feel free to correct me in the comments below, because I'm open to learning. But I am going to express my own just subjective point of view, and I feel like I can actually back it up with some level of rationale. Okay, so whether you can determine whether you think that's real or not. So point number one, right? I guess my initial assumption is that if one is making minimum wage, then one is single and doesn't have the complexity of a family to deal with yet, right? This is probably not exactly true in real life, obviously. I get that, right? However, if this household is made up of, say, a family, then I'm assuming that means at least two minimum wage earners and some children. Thus, at least the income is doubled in said household, okay? Sure, that might not be much in absolute terms of actual dollars, assuming both actually only made minimum wage, but in relative terms, it's quite a lot, just because each person separately, they were not making much money to begin with, right? So doubling a small amount makes it feel like more, a lot more, right? Now, I know there are other arguments against the coupling assumption as well, right? Because there are certainly many instances of single parents with multiple children, but should that be the norm that we're preparing for, that housing should be built for single parents household rather than a nuclear family? Oh boy, this is starting to make me sound like a real conservative, isn't it? Oh well, got off on a tangent, right? So, but still, I'm gonna go back to my initial assumptions. That if you're making minimum wage, hopefully you're both young and single. And in that case, why would someone like that need a two-bedroom apartment? Modest or not, right? First of all, I don't know what the heck a modest two-bedroom means, right? In fact, if you're single and making minimum wage, ideally live with your parents still, right? Because, clearly this person has not figured out their long-term career options quite yet, right? So they're functionally still a child, right? So do what children do. Stay in the nest, right? You're not ready to go out. Okay. Oh, point number two, or what I would call my main crucial thing I want to get across in this clip, is how absurd that the media wants minimum wage to equate to a modest multi-room apartment. What? Anyone making the minimum wage, the implication is that they literally have no skill that the value that they live in actually value. Look, I am absolutely not saying that those people have no value, okay? That's not true. I have had minimum wage fast food jobs personally, right? But that was when I was a student and needed some lunch money, right? Just because someone doesn't have the skill at that specific moment in time doesn't mean that they won't later on, right? But what I'm trying to get at is that why anybody, much less a media pundit, would think that they can support a household, like people on minimum wage, to one person to be able to support a household, right? I can see now why some liberals want to aim for what they call a living wage, right, rather than a minimum wage, right? That would actually make more sense semantically, right? Because in my mind, if you make minimum wage, then shouldn't your expectation for accommodations also be, well, the minimum, whatever you want to call it, right? No? And that's why the second part, where John Oliver, someone who I consider relatively fairly reasonable, right? When he says, oh, they can't afford a modest 2-bedroom home, and phrase that as a problem, that just seems so absurd to me, okay? The fact that some media personality talks about a modest 2-bedroom home as a reasonable expectation for someone making minimum wage, really, to me, just speaks to how wonderfully rich this country is, right? Because do you know what I think the minimum accommodation would be? How about get a roommate in a single bedroom apartment, right? Or better yet, live in a studio, okay? The smallest place that you can live in, and get a roommate. Get a bunk bed, right? And come back and tell me that people making minimum wage still can't afford that. Or heck, live in a basement apartment that may or may not be legal depending on what area that you're in, right? Because I did that when I was starting out. My rent was absolutely manageable, despite the fact that my job really paid absolutely nothing at the time either, okay? Now, finally, I want to compare this kind of high spending type of expectation on housing, or high return type of expectation on housing, really, right? Despite the, clearly low skilled labor and or experience level, the mentality of this versus what I'm much more used to, which is the FIRE mentality, right? In the mainstream, the very left-leaning perspective of, as exemplified by the John Oliver piece, somehow anyone who just got a job, just entered the workforce, that's why they're making minimum wage, presumably, deserves a 2-bedroom apartment. But people who are interested in financial independence or retiring early are always talking about, house hacking, by the way, which just means getting a roommate or 2 or whatever amount needed to either minimize or possibly cancel out your spending on housing entirely, right? So somehow people who are interested in FIRE can figure out essentially living for free, while the rest of the working class are clamoring instead for the government to institute policies so that people at the very bottom of the working world can also have a 2-bedroom apartment. It is absolutely mind-blowing to me, because I personally have never ever lived in anything bigger than a 1-bedroom apartment until I already hit my FIRE goal and retired, okay? And that was when I was already a multi-millionaire. That's when I had better than a 1-bedroom apartment. And yet, John Oliver thinks that people with a minimum wage deserves a 2-bedroom apartment. Yeah, as soon as they get a paycheck, I guess I know I will always be the minority, right? For wanting to actually, minimize my housing cost. But do you really think that people who literally can't manage money at all, if given a bigger apartment somehow, will improve their financial literacy or situation? Because remember, things not earned just won't stick, okay? Lottery winners should have taught us that key lesson in life already. Anyway, in conclusion, am I just bitter because nobody gave me a sweet 2-bedroom apartment when I was just starting out? Sure, maybe. Or maybe it's because I grew up in New York City and everybody over there was already paying way more than 1/3 for their housing costs, so I'm used to the idea. In either case, most Americans are as wasteful with space as they are with money, so think about what really matters to you, right? To be given something by the government, which can also be taken away, right, when the administration inevitably changes, or, right, get the skills and mentality to earn what you have, right? Even if it's just a little bit more at a time, incrementally, right? By your own abilities, okay? You know why the latter is more preferable in my book, right? Because accumulated skill and a hardened mentality can never ever be taken from you, right? That's the real treasure, whereas money comes and money goes, especially to the poor and unskilled and probably uneducated, okay? Cheers, à la prochaine.